살던 날 사고를 당했고 다시 눈을
Hello! Welcome back to my channel! In this video, I will invite you to watch a very cool story entitled Reborn as a Kingmaker of My Useless Chaebol Dad. Before the story begins, don't forget to subscribe and like. Rather than being curious, let's continue watching this video until the end of the story. Ready?
The freezing, torrential rain washed away the blood pooling beneath Dujin's shattered body, completely obliterating any physical trace of the once proud heir to the majestic Taeyang group. Betrayed by his ruthless, power-hungry uncle and framed for a colossal corporate embezzlement scandal, his magnificent life had been violently, permanently extinguished in a desolate alleyway. As his vision rapidly faded into a suffocating, inescapable darkness, his final, agonizing thoughts centered not on his own catastrophic demise, but on the pathetic, utterly useless father whose incompetence had doomed their entire family branch. He closed his eyes, entirely accepting the cold, bitter embrace of absolute death, his soul burdened by a mountainous, crushing mountain of unspoken regrets and monumental failures. However, the cruel, unrelenting universe was not entirely finished with the disgraced Chaebol Scion. Instead of descending into the eternal void, Dujin was violently jolted awake by the blinding, magnificent sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of his childhood bedroom. He stared at his small, unblemished hands in absolute, breathless shock, completely disoriented by the surreal, impossible reality unfolding before his widened eyes. The calendar resting on his mahogany desk confirmed the miraculous, terrifying truth. He had regressed exactly 20 years into the past, miraculously deposited back into the fragile body of his 7-year-old self. The monumental, world-ending tragedy that had destroyed his entire bloodline was now merely a distant, preventable nightmare. Stepping out of his opulent quarters, the young mastermind immediately sought out the root cause of his previous timeline's catastrophic downfall, his biological father, Tae-soo. He found the said son of the Taeyang Empire lounging in the sunlit conservatory, completely ignoring a stack of fetal corporate reports in favor of sipping an expensive, vintage whiskey and polishing his collection of luxury watches. In his past life, Dujin had deeply despised this pathetic, unambitious playboy, constantly resenting his father's absolute refusal to engage in the vicious, high-stakes succession war. But armed with the devastating, futuristic knowledge of their impending ruin, the reincarnated son realized that his father's complete lack of ambition was actually a brilliant, unexploited blank canvas. The overarching patriarch of the family, Chairman Jin-ho, ruled the sprawling, global conglomerate with a terrifying, iron-fisted tyranny that demanded absolute, unmitigated perfection from his offspring. The eldest uncle, a calculating, venomous predator, and the second aunt, a master of psychological manipulation, were already deeply entrenched in a brutal, cutthroat campaign to secure the ultimate throne. They completely dismissed Tae-soo as a harmless, pathetic joke, entirely unworthy of their strategic consideration or lethal attention. Dujin instantly recognized this massive, arrogant blind spot as his ultimate tactical advantage. He would weaponize his father's useless reputation, operating perfectly undetected in the shadows while maneuvering the oblivious playboy into the most powerful position in the nation. The initial, highly complex phase of Dujin's grand strategy required fundamentally altering the chairman's deeply entrenched, historically negative perception of his youngest son. During the highly anticipated, intensely stressful monthly family dinner, the young boy executed his first, flawless psychological maneuver. While the elder siblings aggressively boasted about their quarterly profit margins and ruthlessly attempted to undermine one another, Dujin subtly whispered a highly advanced, futuristic real estate prediction into his oblivious father's ear. Desperate to contribute to the conversation and entirely unaware of the information's profound accuracy, Tae-soo casually promoted the brilliant investment strategy to the formidable patriarch. The grand dining room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence as Chairman Jin-ho slowly lowered his silver chopsticks, his piercing, intimidating gaze locking onto his notoriously incompetent son. The proposed acquisition of the barren, seemingly worthless coastal district entirely contradicted the current market trends, yet it possessed a radical, undeniable logistical brilliance that the elder siblings had completely overlooked. When the patriarch demanded further elaboration, Doo-jin seamlessly guided his father's responses through a series of subtle, prearranged hand signals beneath the table, feeding him complex infrastructural terminology. The flawless performance left the predatory uncle and the aunt entirely speechless, planting the very first, microscopic seed of genuine respect within the ruthless chairman's hardened heart. Following the unprecedented, shocking triumph at the family estate, Tae-soo returned to his private quarters in a state of bewildered, almost comical euphoria. He genuinely believed he had experienced a sudden, miraculous stroke of spontaneous business genius, completely oblivious to the brilliant, 7-year-old puppet master orchestrating his every move. Doo-jin maintained a posture of innocent, childlike admiration, masking his cold, intensely calculating intellect behind a facade of wide-eyed devotion. He understood that revealing his true, reincarnated nature would completely shatter his father's fragile ego and trigger an unnecessary, highly dangerous psychological crisis. The useless Chaebol needed to genuinely believe he was naturally evolving into a formidable corporate titan. The subsequent months witnessed the quiet, highly systematic construction of Doo-jin's invisible, impenetrable support network. Utilizing his comprehensive, futuristic knowledge of the global stock market, the young boy covertly established a massive, heavily encrypted offshore investment portfolio. He aggressively capitalized on impending, highly lucrative technological booms and the catastrophic financial crashes, rapidly accumulating a staggering, untraceable personal fortune that entirely rivaled his family's primary corporate accounts. A sudden, seemingly miraculous ascension through the company ranks, completely bypassing the aggressive financial blockades erected by his jealous siblings. The first major, highly visible corporate battlefield emerged during the catastrophic negotiations for the acquisition of a massive, heavily indebted semiconductor manufacturing firm. The eldest uncle, driven by sheer, blinding arrogance and the desperate need to impress the chairman, aggressively pushed for a hostile, overwhelmingly expensive takeover that Doo-jin knew would eventually bankrupt that specific division. Utilizing his newly acquired, massive shadow wealth, the regressed son hired a brilliant, fiercely independent financial proxy to discreetly lack devastating, highly accurate internal audits regarding the failing semiconductor firm directly to Tae-soo. Armed with this pristine, absolutely devastating intelligence, the notoriously useless fuzzer strolled into the emergency executive board meeting with an uncharacteristic, highly manufactured swagger. Just as the eldest uncle prepared to sign the catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar acquisition contract, Tae-soo dramatically tossed the covertly acquired audit reports onto the polished mahogany table. The subsequent, explosive revelation of the semiconductor firm's hidden, toxic debt completely obliterated the eldest son's aggressive proposal, saving the Taeyang Group from a massive, historically devastating financial blunder. Chairman Jin-ho watched the chaotic fallout with cold, evaluating eyes, realizing that his youngest son had miraculously transformed from a pathetic liability into a highly effective, deeply perceptive corporate asset. The immediate, highly toxic fallout from the aborted acquisition violently destabilized the fragile, deeply corrupted hierarchy within the corporate headquarters. The eldest uncle, profoundly humiliated and completely enraged by his sudden loss of face, launched a vicious, highly coordinated internal investigation designed to expose Tae-soo's newfound intelligence as a fraudulent, orchestrated scam. He deployed his most ruthless, highly paid corporate spies to infiltrate the youngest son's private household, desperately searching for the hidden advisors or illicit consultants feeding the playboy such high-level strategic data. However, the arrogant heir entirely failed to consider that the mastermind systematically destroying his empire was currently sitting in the garden, casually building a fortress out of wooden building blocks. Do-jin, possessing an intimate, terrifyingly accurate knowledge of his uncle's aggressive espionage tactics from his previous timeline, expertly weaponized the infiltration. He deliberately left carefully forged, highly misleading documents lying around the estate, pointing toward a completely fabricated, non-existent consortium of foreign investors backing his father. The eldest uncle's spies eagerly swallowed the brilliantly constructed bite, delivering the false intelligence directly to their master. The resulting, highly paranoid goose chase completely consumed the eldest sibling's resources and the attention, blinding him to the actual, devastatingly effective infrastructural takeover Do-jin was quietly executing right beneath his nose. As the corporate espionage war raged silently in the shadows, the second and a terrifyingly perceptive, deeply manipulative sociopath began to suspect that the sudden, miraculous competence of her younger brother was entirely unnatural. Unlike the eldest uncle, who relied on blunt, overwhelming financial force, she preferred utilizing devastating, highly targeted social sabotage to destroy her rivals. She orchestrated a massive, highly publicized philanthropic gala, secretly intending to humiliate Tae-soo by forcing him to debate complex, macroeconomic policies on live television before the nation's most elite, fiercely critical financial journalists. It was a flawless, seemingly inescapable trap designed to permanently strip away his newly acquired, highly fragile facade of corporate competence. Recognizing the immense, catastrophic danger of the impending gala, the 7-year-old Kingmaker initiated a rigorous, highly intensive, and deeply exhausting training regimen for his oblivious father. Do-jin disguised the complex economic tutoring as a simple, engaging memory game, utilizing his adorable, innocent persona to repeatedly drill advanced statistical models, geopolitical forecasts, and the flawless rhetorical counter-arguments into Tae-soo's head. The lazy playboy, highly motivated by a desperate desire to impress his exceptionally bright son, unknowingly memorized a masterclass in global financial strategy, completely unaware that he was being meticulously programmed to survive a televised assassination attempt. The night of the grand philanthropic gala arrived, transforming the massive, crystalline ballroom into a highly volatile, intensely scrutinized coliseum of corporate warfare. As anticipated, the second and smoothly hijacked the ceremonial proceedings, directing a panel of aggressive, pre-bribed journalists to corner Tae-soo with a barrage of incredibly hostile, impossibly complex macroeconomic inquiries. The entire aristocratic assembly held their collective breath, fully expecting the notorious playboy to publicly crumble and permanently destroy his fragile, newly established reputation. Chairman Jin-ho observed the unfolding spectacle from the Fei-Pei balcony, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, uncompromising judgment. However, the meticulously programmed training instantly kicked in. Tae-soo, bolstered by the reassuring, highly encouraging smile of his young son sitting in the front row, effortlessly parried the aggressive journalistic assault. He deployed the brilliant, highly advanced rhetorical strategies Do-jin had drilled into him, completely dismantling the hostile inquiries with a calm, deeply impressive, and the highly analytical charisma that completely shocked the LED audience. He not only survived the vicious, highly coordinated ambush, but has spectacularly turned the tables, eloquently articulating a visionary, highly progressive economic roadmap that left the journalists entirely speechless and the second and grinding her teeth in absolute, unmitigated fury. The staggering, highly televised triumph at the gala completely shifted the fundamental, underlying power dynamics of the entire Taeyang group. Chairman Jin Ho, highly impressed by his youngest son's undeniable, spectacular display of public competence, officially promoted Tae-soo to the prestigious, highly coveted position of Executive Managing Director of the newly established Future Strategy Division. This massive, unprecedented elevation completely bypassed the traditional, deeply entrenched corporate hierarchy, granting the formerly useless playboy immense, practically unchecked authority over the conglomerate's most crucial, highly lucrative long-term investments. The puppet had officially, permanently ascended the throne, placing absolute, overwhelming corporate power directly into the tiny, brilliant hands of his reincarnated son. With the massive resources of the Future Strategy Division now firmly under his complete, invisible control, Doo-jin initiated a breathtakingly aggressive, highly accelerated campaign of global expansion. He utilized his father as the highly charismatic, widely celebrated public face of the operation, while he quietly, ruthlessly dictated the acquisition of revolutionary, highly disruptive startup companies that he knew would dominate the next 2 decades. They secured massive, globally exclusive patents in advanced battery technology, artificial intelligence, and the next-generation logistics, rapidly transforming the Taeyang Group from a traditional, highly stagnant manufacturing dinosaur into an untouchable, hyper-modern global titan. The terrifying, exponential growth of the youngest brother's division pushed the elder siblings into a state of absolute, panic-induced desperation. Realizing that traditional corporate warfare was entirely useless against Tae-soo's seemingly infallible, prophetic business instincts, the eldest uncle resorted to highly illegal, intensely violent countermeasures. He contracted a notorious, highly professional syndicate of corporate mercenaries to intercept and permanently silence his younger brother during a critical, highly secretive business trip to a remote, deeply unregulated overseas manufacturing facility. It was a brutal, highly predictable escalation that Doo-jin had anticipated and meticulously prepared for since the very first day of his regression. Utilizing his massive, untraceable shadow wells, the young Kingmaker had already completely compromised the mercenary syndicate's upper echelon months prior. When the heavily armed assassins breached Tae-soo's remote hotel suite, they didn't unleash a hail of lethal gunfire. Instead, they respectfully handed the terrified, completely bewildered executive a heavily encrypted USB drive containing pristine, undeniable audio and visual evidence of the eldest uncle ordering the hit. Doo-jin's brilliant, highly preemptive counter-strike not only guaranteed his father's absolute physical safety, but it successfully acquired the ultimate, devastating weapon required to completely, permanently annihilate the eldest sibling's claim to the succession. The subsequent, highly explosive emergency board meeting at the Seoul headquarters was a masterclass in psychological devastation and the absolute, unmitigated corporate execution. Tae-soo, deeply traumatized by the assassination attempt but fiercely emboldened by the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence provided by his mysterious informants, confronted his brother before the entire executive council. As the damning audio recordings echoed through the massive boardroom, the eldest uncle's arrogant, highly entitled facade violently collapsed, his face draining of all color as he realized his absolute, catastrophic ruin. Chairman Jin Ho, disgusted by the sheer, sloppy incompetence of the failed assassination, permanently stripped his eldest son of all corporate titles and banished him to a desolate, completely powerless overseas subsidiary. With the primary, highly aggressive antagonist entirely removed from the board, the highly manipulative second aunt realized she was entirely outmatched by her younger brother's terrifying, seemingly omniscient strategic foresight. Attempting to preserve her own highly precarious position within the conglomerate, she immediately approached Tae-soo with a highly submissive, heavily conditional offer of permanent alliance and the absolute loyalty. She offered to completely dismantle her own, highly extensive intelligence networks and integrate them directly into his future strategy division in exchange for guaranteed, highly lucrative stock options and the immunity from future purges. Du Jin, advising his father through a highly secure, heavily encrypted earpiece, instructed Tae-soo to graciously accept the surrender, recognizing the immense, highly pragmatic value of absorbing her vast, deeply entrenched corporate espionage apparatus. This brilliant, highly magnanimous display of executive mercy completely solidified Tae-soo's reputation as a firm, highly capable, yet deeply compassionate leader, entirely contrasting the ruthless, highly toxic management style of his disgraced older brother. The corporate executives, exhausted by decades of brutal, highly destructive infighting, eagerly rallied behind the youngest son, cementing his status as the absolute, undisputed heir apparent to the entire global empire. As Du-jin physically matured into a remarkably intelligent, highly poised teenager, the massive, highly complex deception surrounding his father's sudden genius became increasingly difficult to maintain. Tae-soo, although genuinely having learned and absorbed a tremendous amount of legitimate business acumen over the years, began to quietly, profoundly suspect the true, highly impossible nature of his son's involvement. He noticed the tiny, highly significant discrepancies, the way Du-jin seamlessly anticipated global crises, his terrifying, deeply unnatural understanding of complex corporate law, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of the ancient, heavily burdened soul hidden behind the boy's youthful eyes. The inevitable, highly emotional confrontation occurred late one evening in the quiet, deeply shadowed sanctuary of the chairman's executive suite, which Tae-soo now officially occupied. The father, abandoning his usual, highly charismatic corporate persona, looked at his teenage son with a mixture of profound, overwhelming gratitude and deep, highly agonizing sorrow. He gently confessed that he knew he was merely the incredibly fortunate, highly visible frontman for a brilliant, unseen architect, and he humbly, tearfully asked his son to finally reveal the truth behind his impossible, terrifying omniscience. It was a moment of absolute, unprecedented vulnerability, completely stripping away the massive, highly constructed facade that had defined their relationship for a decade. Faced with his father's genuine, deeply moving sincerity, the reincarnated Kingmaker finally allowed the heavy, suffocating mask of childish innocence to permanently slip. Du-jin quietly, intensely recounted the horrific, blood-soaked tragedy of his previous life, detailing the massive betrayal, the agonizing mess, and the desperate, burning resolve that had fueled his relentless, highly calculated manipulation of the timeline. He explicitly explained that every single lie, every orchestrated triumph, and every ruthlessly destroyed enemy was entirely dedicated to ensuring his father's survival and elevating their family to absolute, untouchable security. The staggering, impossible weight of the revelation left Tae-soo completely breathless, tears streaming down his face as he fully comprehended the monumental, agonizing sacrifice his son had silently endured. Instead of reacting with fear, anger, or highly predictable parental outrage, the reformed playboy stepped forward and he pulled his brilliant, deeply traumatized son into a fierce, highly protective embrace. He recognized that Du-jin had completely sacrificed his own childhood, carrying the agonizing, suffocating burden of an entire empire to protect a father who had previously been entirely unworthy of such profound devotion. In that quiet, deeply pivotal moment, Tae-soo silently swore an unbreakable, highly sacred oath to become the formidable, genuinely capable leader his son had originally engineered him to be. The highly complex, deeply manipulative puppet master dynamic was permanently dissolved, replaced by a genuine, highly formidable, and beautifully synchronized partnership built on absolute, unmitigated truth. The seamless, highly coordinated transition of genuine, functional power from the father to the maturing son was executed with breathtaking, highly orchestrated precision over the subsequent years. As Dujin officially entered the corporate hierarchy under his own name, he completely dominated the global financial sector, utilizing his vast, unparalleled futuristic knowledge to execute massive, highly aggressive takeovers that left rival conglomerates in absolute ruins. The global media hailed him as an unprecedented, terrifyingly brilliant prodigy, completely unaware that his highly celebrated instincts were actually the result of a lived, highly agonizing previous timeline. The Taiyang Group expanded into a truly untouchable, monolithic entity, completely insulated from the traditional, highly destructive cycles of economic recession. Chairman Jin Ho, observing the spectacular, undeniably brilliant synergy between his reformed son and his terrifyingly capable grandson, finally experienced a profound, deeply satisfying sense of complete dynastic security. The ruthless, highly demanding patriarch recognized that his historical methodology of pitting his children against one another in brutal, highly toxic death matches was ultimately inferior to the absolute, unshakable unity displayed by Tae-soo and Dujin. On his deathbed, surrounded by the towering, highly successful empire they had built, the elder chairman officially, permanently transferred the ultimate, highly coveted title of Supreme Patriarch directly to Tae-soo, with Dujin explicitly named as the sole, undisputed successor. Standing together on the glass-domed, highly elevated observation deck of the newly constructed Taiyang Global Headquarters, the father and the son looked out all for the sprawling, brilliantly illuminated metropolis they now entirely commanded. The horrific, blood-soaked alleyway where Dujin had died in his previous life was completely, permanently erased from existence, replaced by a massive, highly progressive philanthropic center funded entirely by his personal shadow wells. The complex, highly dangerous game of corporate survival and the desperate regression had successfully yielded the absolute finest, most flawless reality the universe could possibly construct. The monumental state funeral of Chairman Jin Ho brought the entire nation's bustling metropolis to a solemn, highly choreographed standstill, marking the definitive end of an archaic, ruthless era. World leaders, rival conglomerate heads, and the elite politicians gathered beneath the cascading, torrential rain, their black umbrellas forming a vast, rippling ocean of mourning around the grand ancestral estate. Tae-soo, dressed in an impeccably tailored, midnight black mourning suit, stood at the vanguard of the procession, radiating an aura of undeniable, terrifyingly calm executive majesty that completely silenced any lingering whispers of his past incompetence. Beside him stood Dujin, now a remarkably poised, fiercely intelligent young man in his early 20s, observing the sprawling assembly with the calculating, predatory gaze of a seasoned apex predator surveying his newly inherited domain. Following the protracted mourning period, the immediate, highly anticipated restructuring of the Taiyang Group's board of directors commenced with a swift, surgical brutality that left industry analysts entirely breathless. Operating as his father's newly appointed chief operations officer, Dujin systematically excised the remaining, deeply entrenched sycophants and the archaic loyalists who had previously enabled his disgraced uncle's toxic regime. He replaced the stagnant, graying executives with a brilliant, fiercely loyal vanguard of young, highly aggressive technological innovators and the financial savants, completely modernizing the conglomerate's overarching command structure. This massive, sweeping internal purge was executed flawlessly, without a single drop of spilled blood or negative press, solidifying an impenetrable, monolithic fortress of absolute loyalty around the new chairman. However, the geopolitical landscape abhorred a vacuum, and the perceived vulnerability of a transitional administration inevitably attracted the ravenous attention of a historical, deeply embittered corporate adversary. The Daesan conglomerate, Taiyang's longest-standing, most venomous domestic rival, launched a spectacular, highly aggressive hostile takeover campaign targeting a critical, heavily contested global supply chain vector. Their ruthless patriarch, a veteran corporate warlord who had frequently clashed with the late Jin-ho, erroneously believed that Tae-soo's refined, diplomatic public persona masked a soft, easily manipulated underbelly. Daesan deliberately flooded the international markets with severely underpriced, subsidized microprocessors, attempting to financially suffocate Taeyang's newly established technology divisions before they could achieve true global dominance. In his previous, agonizingly tragic timeline, this exact predatory maneuver had catastrophically crippled the Taeyang group, initiating the slow, bleeding decline that eventually led to his uncle's treasonous embezzlement. Armed with the pristine, horrific historical knowledge, Du-jin had already spent the preceding decade quietly, relentlessly stockpiling exclusive mining rights for essential rare earth minerals across 3 distinct continents. Instead of reacting with frantic, defensive panic, the young Kingmaker orchestrated a brilliant, highly deceptive tactical retreat, deliberately allowing the Daesan conglomerate to aggressively overextend their manufacturing lines and assume massive, highly toxic international debts. He cultivated an illusion of corporate weakness, patiently watching his arrogant adversaries enthusiastically sprint directly into a meticulously prepared, inescapable financial slaughterhouse. The true, breathtaking extent of Tae-soo's remarkable personal evolution was spectacularly showcased during a highly publicized, supposedly conciliatory summit between the 2 rival chairmen. Seated across from the veteran predator in a sprawling, glass-walled conference room, the once useless playboy projected a terrifyingly tranquil, impenetrable serenity that profoundly unnerved the older executive. When the Daesan patriarch smugly offered a humiliating, highly predatory buyout of Taeyang's struggling divisions, Tae-soo simply smiled, gently swirling his chup of artisanal tea before delivering a devastating, elegantly phrased counter-threat. He casually referenced deeply buried, highly classified regulatory violations within Daesan's overseas subsidiaries, utilizing a tone so exquisitely polite that the underlying promise of absolute annihilation hit the rival chairman with the concussive force of a physical blow. Simultaneously, the invisible, highly destructive battlefield shifted to the chaotic frenzy of the international stock exchanges and the overseas regulatory commissions. Du-jin unleashed a proprietary, terrifyingly advanced algorithmic trading swarm he had been designing in secret for years, injecting colossal, carefully staggered bursts of capital into the market to create wild, artificial fluctuations. This breathtaking, high-frequency digital warfare systematically destabilized Daesan's primary stock valuations, triggering cascading, panic-driven sell-offs among their terrified institutional investors. The brilliant, entirely legal manipulation completely choked off the rival conglomerate's liquidity, leaving them financially stranded and desperately bleeding capital while Taeyang's core assets remained perfectly, undeniably insulated. Desperate to survive the crushing, invisible economic strangulation, the Daesan leadership committed a fatal, incredibly sloppy tactical error. They sought out the bitter, exiled remnants of Taeyang's discarded past. The disgraced eldest uncle, rotting in his powerless overseas banishment, eagerly accepted a treasonous, highly lucrative pact with the enemy, promising to deliver proprietary, next-generation schematics in exchange for a guaranteed seat on their executive board. Consumed by a toxic, blinding cocktail of vengeance and the unearned arrogance, the exiled sibling initiated a complex, highly illegal digital infiltration, attempting to breach the heavily fortified mainframe of the Future Strategy Division to steal the crown jewels of his nephew's empire. Unbeknownst to the traitorous uncle, his every digital movement was being seamlessly, meticulously tracked by the fairy woman he had historically underestimated, the second aunt. Having fully, genuinely integrated her vast, terrifyingly efficient corporate espionage network into Du-jin's intelligence apparatus, she intercepted the encrypted communications with surgical, effortless precision. She presented the pristine, incontrovertible evidence of the treason directly to the young chief operations officer. Her sharp, calculating eyes gleaming with a profound, deeply satisfying predatory amusement. The alliance between the Kingmaker and the Master Spy had blossomed into an incredibly lethal, perfectly synchronized mechanism of absolute corporate defense, entirely neutralizing external threats before they could even materialize. Recognizing the ultimate, golden opportunity to permanently eradicate two massive adversaries with a single, flawless stroke, Dujin engineered a breathtaking, highly deceptive counter-sting operation. He instructed his ant to quietly unblock the uncle's infiltration route, deliberately feeding the traitor a massive cache of catastrophically flawed, highly dangerous schematics for a revolutionary solid-state battery. The stolen data was a brilliant, incredibly sophisticated forgery, designed to pass preliminary scientific vetting while guaranteeing a spectacular, highly volatile thermal runaway failure during mass production. The Daesan conglomerate, desperate for a technological miracle to save their crashing stock prices, eagerly swallowed the poison bite, immediately sinking billions of borrowed dollars into manufacturing the fraudulent technology. The resulting global product launch was an apocalyptic, globally televised disaster of unprecedented, catastrophic proportions. Within weeks of hitting the international market, the flagship Daesan devices began experiencing violent, highly publicized spontaneous combustions, causing millions in property damage and sparking a massive, unified outcry from international consumer protection agencies. The rival conglomerate's stock valuation plummeted into absolute, unrecoverable freefall, triggering immediate, highly aggressive investigations from furious governmental regulatory bodies across the globe. The monumental, humiliating failure instantly rendered the historical adversary completely insolvent, burying them under a suffocating mountain of inescapable class action lawsuits and the astronomical punitive fines. In the chaotic, screaming fallout of the corporate collapse, the disgraced eldest uncle finally realized the absolute, terrifying totality of his own monumental ruin. Hunted by furious Daesan executives who rightfully blamed him for the catastrophic sabotage, and permanently disowned by the international banking community, he was left entirely destitute, shivering in a cheap, windowless motel room on the edge of the city. He stared at his burner phone, desperately waiting for a savior that would never arrive, fully comprehending that his brilliant, terrifying nephew had outmaneuvered him with the effortless, casual disdain of a deity-crushing and insignificant insect. His narrative ended not with a grand, tragic explosion, but with a pathetic, whimpering fade into absolute, forgotten obscurity. As the smoking, shattered ruins of the Daesan Empire settled, the Taiyang group swooped in with the terrifying, majestic grace of a sovereign claiming its conquered territory. Dujin executed a brilliant, highly complex series of shell company acquisitions, purchasing the rival's liquidated manufacturing infrastructure and the global distribution networks for microscopic pennies on the dollar. This ultimate, indisputable corporate checkmate solidified an absolute, unparalleled domestic monopoly for Taiyang, brilliantly structured to entirely bypass antitrust legislation through a labyrinth of decentralized, highly independent subsidiaries. The historical war was permanently concluded, leaving Taesu and Dujin sitting alone atop an incomparable, monolithic mountain of global economic supremacy. Having successfully conquered the chaotic, deeply volatile economic sector, the visionary young executive realized that ensuring permanent, multi-generational dynastic security required absolute, unshakable legislative stability. Dujin quietly initiated a massive, heavily funded philanthropic lobbying initiative, systematically bucking a new wave of progressive, highly intelligent, and technologically literate politicians across the national spectrum. By essentially bankrolling the ideological transformation of the country's infrastructural leadership, he ensured that future governmental regulations would naturally, seamlessly align with Taiyang's overarching, hypermodern corporate objectives. The empire was no longer merely navigating the laws of the land. It was actively, brilliantly rewriting the fundamental legislative DNA of the entire nation. The profound, incredibly complex relationship between the father and the son deepened into a beautiful, remarkably egalitarian partnership that completely transcended traditional familial hierarchies. Taesu, observing his son orchestrate the geopolitical landscape with breathtaking, flawless precision, realized that Dujin was no longer just a traumatized, desperate regressor fighting for survival, but a magnificent, visionary architect constructing a literal utopia. They spent their evenings in the executive suite, sharing rare, aged bourbons while engaging in intense, highly intellectual debates regarding the ethical responsibilities of possessing such staggering, unchecked global influence. Their bond, forged in the agonizing, silent fires of our rewritten timeline, had evolved into an unbreakable, deeply respectful alliance of absolute equals. For the very first time across two exhausting, wildly disparate lifetimes, Dujin finally permitted himself the luxurious, previously unimaginable concept of a genuine, uninterrupted vacation. He traveled anonymously to the coastal district he had famously advised his father to purchase decades ago, which had now blossomed into a sprawling, breathtakingly futuristic smart city powered entirely by renewable Taiyang energy grids. Walking along the pristine, bioluminescent shoreline, listening to the gentle, rhythmic crashing of the waves, he felt the heavy, suffocating phantom weight of his previous, bloody death finally, permanently lift from his weary shoulders. The agonizing, relentless survival instinct that had driven him for 20 years slowly melted away, replaced by a profound, deeply resonant sense of absolute, unmitigated peace. During this period of profound internal healing, the young Kingmaker unexpectedly crossed paths with a brilliant, fiercely independent venture capitalist named Seo Yan, whose intellect terrifyingly rivaled his own. Unlike the cold, strictly transactional arranged marriages that had defined the toxic aristocratic culture of his past life, their dynamic crackled with a genuine, highly competitive, and deeply electric mutual respect. She completely refused to be intimidated by his monolithic corporate pedigree, routinely challenging his macroeconomic philosophies with a sharp, devastating wit that left him genuinely, delightfully off balance. For the first time, Dujin found himself eagerly anticipating the chaotic, unpredictable variables of human connection, building a foundational partnership based on absolute, intellectual equality rather than calculated manipulation. The dawn of the new decade marked the explosive, highly anticipated rollout of Taiyang's ultimate technological singularity, a revolutionary, highly empathetic artificial intelligence platform that completely disrupted global labor paradigms. Recognizing the immense, potentially catastrophic societal upheaval this automation would inevitably cause, Dujin proactively implemented a sweeping, incredibly progressive corporate initiative. He established a massive, self-sustaining universal basic income trust, funded entirely by a voluntary, staggering percentage of the conglomerate's automated profit margins, ensuring that displaced workers were comprehensively retrained and financially protected. This breathtakingly empathetic maneuver completely neutralized the impending global backlash, rebranding the ruthless Chaebol as a benevolent, highly responsible steward of humanity's technological evolution. Naturally, the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of Taiyang's expanding global influence triggered deep-seated, highly paranoid anxieties among the traditional, deeply entrenched political superpowers of the Western Hemisphere. A highly coordinated coalition of international regulatory bodies threatened to impose massive, crippling economic sanctions, falsely accusing the Korean conglomerate of aggressive monopolistic overreach and the illicit data harvesting. Dujin navigated this incredibly volatile, high-stakes geopolitical minefield with the surgical, terrifyingly calm precision of a veteran bomb technician. He didn't respond with frantic, defensive denials or aggressive legal posturing. Instead, he deployed a subtle, incredibly sophisticated display of asymmetric diplomatic leverage. During a highly classified, closed-door summit with the world's leading economic ministers, the young chief operations officer casually produced a heavily encrypted, flawlessly detailed dossier. The documents quietly, undeniably proved that Taiyang's proprietary technological infrastructure was already fundamentally woven into the underlying, critical communication grids and the financial networks of every major participating nation. It was a brilliant, unspoken, and terrifyingly polite threat. Attempting to sanction or dismantle the conglomerate would trigger an instantaneous, catastrophic collapse of their own domestic economies. The hostile, aggressive posturing of the international coalition evaporated instantly, replaced by a pale, highly respectful realization that they were no more longer negotiating with a mere corporation, but with an inescapable, global force of nature. The resulting diplomatic capitulation culminated in the historic signing of the Global Commerce Accords, a sweeping, unprecedented treaty that officially recognized the Taiyang Group as a quasi-sovereign, highly independent regulatory entity. The conglomerate was granted immense, unparalleled authority to unilaterally dictate international trade policies, establish universal technological standards, and enforce aggressive, mandatory environmental sustainability goals across all allied nations. Dujin had successfully elevated his family's legacy from a powerful, domestic business empire into the undisputed, central nervous system of the modern, interconnected world. The chaotic, deeply flawed global market was now operating in perfect, seamless alignment with his visionary, meticulously constructed architectural blueprint. However, the relentless, grueling stresses of navigating 3 decades of ruthless corporate warfare eventually began to quietly, undeniably manifest within the physical health of the reigning patriarch. While not immediately fatal, a series of mild, highly secretive cardiovascular episodes signaled to Taesu that his remarkable, miraculous tenure as the undisputed king of the business world was naturally approaching its twilight. Instead of clinging to his supreme authority with the paranoid, toxic desperation that had consumed his own father, he embraced the impending transition with a profound, deeply graceful acceptance. He summoned Dujin to the secluded, traditional gardens of the ancestral estate, quietly initiating the complex, highly emotional preparations for his final, greatest act as chairman. The upcoming succession ceremony was meticulously engineered to be an unprecedented, breathtakingly transparent spectacle, completely devoid of the brutal, blood-soaked infighting that traditionally plagued Korean corporate transitions. There would be no more backroom betrayals, no more desperate shareholder rebellions, and no more fractured family loyalties. The entire, sprawling empire stood in absolute, unified, and fiercely devoted lockstep behind their brilliant crown prince. Doo-jin, looking out over the impeccably manicured gardens, felt the immense, staggering gravity of the moment settle deeply into his bones, recognizing that he was finally, officially preparing to accept the towering mantle he had functionally, invisibly worn for his entire existence. In the weeks preceding the monumental transition, the second aunt officially submitted her resignation, choosing to gracefully retire from the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world of corporate espionage. She formally handed the heavily encrypted reins of her vast, terrifyingly efficient intelligence division to a highly capable, fiercely loyal successor she had personally groomed under Doo-jin's strict guidance. During her final, deeply poignant departure meeting, she shared a rare, genuinely warm, and surprisingly vulnerable moment with her nephew, pouring him a cup of artisanal tea. She looked him directly in the eyes, softly but firmly acknowledging that while her brother wore the crown, everyone in the inner circle knew that Doo-jin was the true, terrifying, and magnificent dragon that had saved their bloodline. The global media apparatus erupted into an absolute, deafening frenzy as the official date of the historic transition was formally announced to the public. High-budget documentaries, exhaustive literary retrospectives, and sweeping journalistic profiles continuously highlighted Tae-soo's astonishing, miraculous transformation from an overlooked, useless playboy into a legendary, universally revered titan of industry. Doo-jin watched the glowing, highly romanticized broadcasts with a quiet, deeply satisfying sense of profound accomplishment, knowing that the meticulously crafted, completely fabricated narrative had successfully calcified into indisputable, historical fact. The dark, agonizing truth of the regression and the desperate, invisible manipulation would remain their beautifully kept, eternal secret. On the silent, highly charged eve of the coronation, the young Kingmaker stood entirely alone on the sweeping balcony of his sprawling, glass-walled penthouse, staring up at the vast, starry canopy. He found himself deeply reflecting on the mysterious, unfathomable mechanics of the universe that had miraculously violently hurled his soul backward through the space-time continuum. He quietly wondered if the cosmos had granted him this impossible, unprecedented second chance not merely to exact petty, familial revenge, but specifically to avert a catastrophic, overarching global economic collapse that his uncle's historical incompetence would have inevitably caused. The staggering, profound scale of his ultimate achievement brought a rare, genuine tear of absolute fulfillment to his calculating eyes. The quiet, introspective solitude was gently broken by the arrival of Tae-soo, who stepped onto the balcony carrying two crystal tumblers and a remarkably expensive, incredibly rare vintage whiskey. It was the exact same brand the playboy had been idly sipping on the surreal, terrifying morning Doo-jin had first awakened in his 7-year-old body, a brilliant, deeply poignant callback to the genesis of their incredible journey. They clinked their glasses together in the crisp night air, sharing a heavy, profoundly communicative silence that required absolutely no more spoken words to convey their overwhelming, mutual gratitude. It was a beautiful, deeply touching acknowledgement of the extraordinary, impossible path they had successfully, flawlessly navigated together. The dawn of the succession ceremony broke with a brilliant, blazing clarity, illuminating the massive, highly advanced architectural marvel of the Taiyang Smart City where the monumental event was being hosted. Tens of thousands of elite corporate executives, influential politicians, and the allied global leaders gathered within the sprawling, heavily secured outdoor amphitheater, their collective anticipation generating an electric, crackling atmosphere. As the grand, soaring orchestral symphony echoed through the high-fidelity acoustic arrays, Dujin walked down the central aisle, his posture radiating an absolute, undisputed sovereign authority that completely captivated the entire, breathless assembly. Taking his place at the grand, obsidian podium, Taesu delivered a farewell address that was incredibly eloquent, deeply moving, and remarkably, genuinely humble. He completely eschewed the traditional, highly arrogant boasting typical of retiring Chaebol patriarchs, instead choosing to publicly, proudly credit his brilliant son as the true, guiding, and the undeniable star of the entire, sprawling conglomerate. With a smooth, deeply symbolic gesture of absolute, unmitigated trust, the elder man formally stepped away from the microphones, passing the heavy, ceremonial chairman's gavel into the waiting, impeccably steady hands of his successor. The transition of supreme, global power was officially, flawlessly complete, entirely devoid of the toxic, blood-soaked tragedies that had haunted their previous existence. Stepping up to the microphones, Dujin looked out over the massive, silent sea of highly influential faces, the staggering, monumental weight of the crowning moment finally, beautifully washing over him. He did not deliver a standard, boring corporate earnings projection. Instead, he unleashed a visionary, breathtakingly ambitious address that promised not just continuous corporate supremacy, but a radical, unyielding commitment to elevating human potential across the entire globe. His voice, resonant with the hard-won, deeply ingrained wisdom of two entirely disparate lifetimes, projected an impenetrable, brilliant confidence that instantly assured the international markets of the empire's absolute, unshakable stability. As his final, powerful words echoed across the vast amphitheater, the entire assembly erupted into an absolute, deafening roar of genuine, thunderous applause that shook the very foundations of the smart city. Dujin stood bathed in the blinding, magnificent flashbulbs of the global press, looking down at his proud, tearful father, fully realizing that the horrific, agonizing timeline of his past was now irrevocably, perfectly rewritten. The pathetic, useless Chaebol had been transformed into a revered, historical legend. The treacherous enemies had been ground into absolute, forgotten dust, and the traumatized, murdered son was now the undisputed, untouchable ruler of the world. The dark, bloody tragedy was officially, permanently dead. The golden, unbreakable age of the Taiyang Empire had triumphantly, magnificently begun. The morning following the spectacular inauguration brought an immediate, seismic paradigm shift across the terrestrial economic landscape. Global markets, typically prone to volatile fluctuations during major corporate transitions, reacted with unparalleled, serene stability, reflecting the international community's absolute faith in the new Supreme Patriarch. Dujin did not waste a single, precious second basking in the glow of his newfound authority. Instead, he immediately convened a closed-door summit with the planet's foremost quantum physicists and the vanguard engineers. His inaugural executive mandate was the establishment of a boundless research initiative aimed at cracking commercial quantum computing, signaling an inexorable march toward an era of limitless technological capability. Xiao Yan, the fiercely brilliant venture capitalist who had captured his heavily guarded heart, seamlessly transitioned from independent challenger to indispensable co-architect of this utopian vision. She spearheaded the integration of Taiyang's burgeoning quantum infrastructure with global public healthcare networks, pioneering predictive medical algorithms that could eradicate genetic diseases before they manifested. Their partnership operated on a plane of transcendent intellectual symbiosis, devoid of the petty ego clashes that characterized lesser executive alliances. Together, they forged a dual-pronged strategy. Du Jin conquered the macroeconomic stratosphere, while Xiao Yan anchored their monumental profits to tangible, humanitarian evolution. Meanwhile, the retired Taesu embraced his twilight years with an exquisite, unbezired grace that profoundly contrasted his previous life's miserable trajectory. Freed from the crushing obligations of boardroom warfare, he relocated to a sprawling, sun-drenched estate in the southern provinces, dedicating his days to the quiet, meticulous art of rare orchid cultivation. He established a private, wildly successful philanthropic foundation dedicated to funding the classical arts, becoming a beloved, enigmatic patron of orchestras and the painters. The former playboy had finally found his truest calling, living a life of serene contentment that served as a beautiful, living testament to his son's temporal sacrifice. However, the inexorable expansion of the Taiyang hegemony inevitably disturbed the slumbering giants of old world, transatlantic wealth. A clandestine cabal of European aristocrats and the American banking dynasties, whose ancestral fortunes relied heavily on fossil fuels and the legacy financial institutions, perceived Du Jin's progressive singularity as an existential threat. Gathering in a subterranean, heavily guarded vault beneath Geneva, these archaic power brokers formulated a desperate, venomous conspiracy to artificially fracture the global supply chains reliant on Taiyang's proprietary technologies. They arrogantly assumed their centuries-old, invisible political influence could effectively blockade the ascendant Korean Empire through coordinated, international legislative embargoes.